I'm Carol Tomlinson, and I am an old person, so I have done lots of things. When I was young, declared that I didn't know what I wanted to be, but it would never be a teacher. And as life evolves, I have now taught in a variety of places for 50 years. That's 50, so that's a long time. I taught in public school, I taught preschool, middle school, and high school, most of the time in middle school, which I dearly loved. And at the university, which I also never anticipated doing, I taught undergraduates and graduates in that part of public school was 21 years and the university was 29. So that's where the 50 comes from. So I have done lots in education, and will tell you that I've been a very lucky person to do the things that I've done and go the places I've gone. But no part of it has been as wonderful as teaching folks like you in classrooms. That's the great joy of it all. So thanks for being here today.
Well, we can't thank you enough for joining us. And do you mind if I just jump right into some of the questions? Because some of the kids and even the teachers are sending questions through the chat. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and put them through the chat. But one of our kids in Florida wants to know, what drew you to the profession of education?
Well, I sort of gave you a hint on that. Nothing did. When I was in 6th grade, we moved from one town where I felt pretty secure to another. And I felt just totally awkward, had no self-confidence, no sense of who I was, and ended up being a 6th grade student in the school where my mother was a teacher. And she was a wonderful mother, and I had an excellent teacher that year. But at dinner, she would say stuff that let me know that somebody had been talking to her about me, or otherwise she wouldn't have known what she was talking about. And I hated that sense of being looked at and studied. So right then I decided teaching was not it. And I guess one of my messages to you today would be life is full of unexpected pathways and some serendipity, and sometimes it goes right and sometimes it goes wrong. But I was doing a job as an advertising manager at Duke University Press, which is a wonderful press, but for me, it was just the worst job in the world. I was bored out of my socks all the time. And one day I decided that if I didn't do something different, I was going to be in deep trouble before long. So at lunch, I found an advertisement in a newspaper for a teaching job that was supposed to begin the following Monday. This was Thursday, I think, maybe Friday. And I could spend the 30 minutes that I have with you telling you that story, and it would offer you some encouragement. But the bottom line is I got the ad out of the newspaper. And to give you a very quick sense of what that job was like, when I got to the school, it was the end of the first marking period. So the kids had been there for 6 weeks or 9, I don't remember, and couldn't find the principal to tell him I was there or find out where to go. So after the bell had rung, an assistant principal took me to the classroom where I was supposed to be, didn't know the subject, didn't know the grade level. And when we got very little K-12 country school thing, got to the classroom door, the assistant principal knocked on the door, and an elderly guy, in my opinion, no doubt younger than I am now, came to the door, and the assistant principal said to him, "Mr. Melton, this is your replacement, you're fired." And that was my first day of teaching, which also doesn't draw you to it too much. And the class was just total chaos that day. He wanted me to teach, and I did have enough presence of mind to tell him that I had agreed to observe for a day before I began teaching. And so that day did not invite me to teaching, but once I got past that, I would have to say to you, I don't think there's better work in the whole world than working with young people who are finding themselves, and they still see the world as alive and full of possibilities, and they're full of surprises, and watching them grow and develop and fall down and get up and try again is just the best thing in the world. So what ultimately drew me to the job that I swore I would never do was the kids themselves.
That had to be no pressure at all, replacing someone who had just gotten fired right there.
Yeah, oh,
I can imagine.
he would have gone home because he was really quite angry, but he drove in a carpool and it was not his day to carpool, so he didn't have transportation. He had, I mean, it sounds like something out of a bad TV show, and it sort of was, but it was a start.
That sounds really, that is an interesting start. One of our teachers down in Florida wanted to know, as one of the gurus of differentiated instruction, where did that come about? How did that come about?
Like most good things that I have been a part of, it came straight from the classroom. Once again, I was young and I didn't have any experience. I was not trained as a teacher because I had declared I would never do that. And so I really went into my first real teaching job cold. Certainly I was in that one I was telling you about, but the one that came after that, where I ended up staying in that district for 21 years and in the school that I was in for 20 of those 21. And so I didn't know anything unusual was going on, but my classes had about 40 or 42 students in them. I just thought that's how it was. And in some parts of the world, of course, there are many more students than that in classrooms. But it took me a little while, not too long, to figure this out, but I had students who in the 7th grade were reading 4 or more years below grade level, and I was a language arts teacher. So I would say at least 50, if not 60% of my students were reading in a grade 1, grade 2, sometimes even pre-primer level. And probably 40%, a little bit more, were reading at a college level. And in between, there was almost nobody there, a few kids that were in between, but it's what you call a bimodal class with a lot of strength and a lot of weakness concentrated at each end of a learning continuum. And so what my colleagues and I found out was that if we taught the way teachers often do, which was go in and teach to the middle, we lost everybody. But if we tried really hard to focus on the kids who were hurting so that we could help them, then the kids who were really reading like college students were bored out of their socks. And so we began to ask ourselves some questions that we went on asking for 20 years. We met, those of us in the same building met almost daily for most of those years. And the ones of us who came from other buildings to meet, to do the same kind of thing in their places, we met at least once or twice a month for almost 20 years. And we ask ourselves the questions teachers ask. This isn't working. Why isn't it working? What can we do better? How do we help kids that are so far ahead and so far behind become part of a team and really have an appreciation for one another? What can we do together that belongs to everybody, but how do we meet kids where they are to let them continue to move forward? And what are sort of the fundamentals of education that make classrooms either sink or float, depending on what's going on? And so, although we never did call it differentiation until I got to the university and had to have a name to put on a research project, the ideas that I've worked with ever since are the ones that my colleagues and I in a small school district, which was the perfect place for me to work, developed with our students over a period of about 20 years.
Now, as a teacher, I have kind of a question here with that, off of that. In your profession as someone who's so accomplished as you are as yourself, I mean, you've done the gambit from pre-K all the way to college, and then the head of an education department and teacher of the year. The awards that you've had and the amount of publications that you've written goes on forever. So, what kind of advice would you have for educators here? Because you've seen education change in 50 years, probably quite a bit. So how can you talk to the teachers and as well as the students who want to be teachers? How can they adapt to the changes to meet the ever evolving needs of students?
Well, I don't want to suggest that that's an easy thing to do, because if you're going to teach, you have to develop some patterns so that you get in your head, well, we'll do this first and then we can move to this, and this works better here rather than here. And people who study the careers of educators tell us that if we don't kind of create habits of teaching within about our first 2 or 3 years, we can't last in the profession. It's too chaotic. So you almost have to create these little ruts that you get into to make the days manageable and predictable, because so many things are coming at you all the time. But then the sort of irony of that is, if you can't get out of those ruts, then you find yourself 20 years later doing what you did 20 years before, and that's not good for you and it's not good for anybody else. I think for me, again, that first experience that I had, even in the classroom that was just so, landing was so incredibly hard, and I didn't know what I was doing, but was to feed off of the kids, to think less about what somebody expected me to do or what I had to do the next day, but what I could do with the kids that would really help them want to come to school, want to learn, feel successful, feel like it was worth the effort on their part to keep going. And if you watch the kids, they change with the world. The next generation is always in a different place than the current generation. And if you live close to that and stick with them, and particularly if your goal is to make the classroom as engaging as possible for kids, because that engagement leads to learning, I don't think you get stuck in those ruts and can't get out of them. I think that keeps you fresh and keeps you moving. The thing with me that I think has kept me going and still does now when I'm no longer officially working and now working harder than I ever have, is that love for the mystery of teaching. Somebody in the US made a comment a few years ago that I thought was fascinating. I never thought of it this way, but she said, isn't it the most wonderful thing in the world to be part of a profession where you go to work every day and know you'll never get it right? And the point of that is, it's not like, well, I figured this out 10 years ago and now I'm going to have to stay here for 15 more, but every day it'll keep you fresh. A musician in the US who was really noted for his skills in playing his instrument. Somebody asked, I think when he was 85, why he was still at it, why he still practiced every day. And he looked at them kind of strangely and said, because I think I'm still learning. And I think if you love learning, classroom's a terrific place for you. Need to love learning, need to love kids, then the match is pretty good. And by the way, I would add, you need to love the content you're going to teach. It's so easy for us now to teach a bunch of facts because we think we're there to prepare kids for a test. And that's really not what curriculum is, and it's not what learning is, and it's not what life is. So you need to see the mystery and the fascination and the humanity and the stuff that you teach so you can take the kids into that as an adventure every day as well. One time early in my writing, I drew a triangle and labeled it the love triangle of education. And my publisher wouldn't let me use that phrase, but anyhow, that's what it was. And what I said was on the triangle, the teacher's at the top of the triangle, not because the teacher's better, but because it is our responsibility to keep things going and make it work. But what makes teaching wonderful is on the bottom angle of the triangle. You look and you think, I have the best job in the world. I go to teach human beings every day, young human beings that are changing in front of your eyes. And every one of them has a different story. And every one of them can teach me more than I can teach them. And when you get a group of them together, the variety and the similarities is just endless. What a job to be able to go to school every day and do that. But on the other side, with the other angle at the bottom, is the content you teach. And if you know it well and you love it deeply, it also is an unending sort of revelation all the time. And so teaching becomes teaching those people I care so much about, this stuff that I care so much about. And differentiation says, whatever it takes to make that work for every kid, I'm game for it. Not just I'm going to do general stuff for a group of general kids, but I want to know the kids well enough to be able to see them as individuals and try to figure out ways to connect them with that stuff. So that's my thing with teaching.
That's wonderful. We have a question from Miss Rodriguez. We'll just go with a couple more questions and we'll let you go. But Miss Rodriguez, I believe, is down in Florida. So you should be able to unmute Miss Rodriguez to ask your question. You had a really good question.
Hi, yes, we are in Florida at Meadow Lakes Academy. It's great to have you here. My question was, or our question was, being that we are, education has been evolving quite a few, as you mentioned, during the years. What would be your opinion on how DI has evolved, and how it has changed to accommodate 21st century learners?
I missed the last part of that, Ralph. Can you say that again for me?
Yeah, I got you. She just wants to know how direct instruction has evolved or how it has changed to accommodate 21st century learners.
Direct instruction?
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
That
ma'am.
was the phrase that I missed. You know, direct instruction is imperative sometimes in classrooms. I mean, if we waited for kids to discover everything themselves, we wouldn't get too far. There's some things we have to share and some things we have to practice and some things we just need to teach kids. But the flip side of that is, as we have understood more from research in psychology and brain science, we understand, and I think we've always known this, that teaching and telling are not synonymous. I can tell you things, but that doesn't mean you learn them. Learning has to happen in you. It has to be your sense-making process, have to be able to attach it to your life and your experiences. And so my best sense of direct instruction is probably not too different than what it was even in that first class that I taught. And that is, there are times when I need to directly teach kids, but if that's really the most consistent part of my teaching, it's awfully hard for me to engage them. It's awfully hard for me to help them connect things to their lives and experiences, which is imperative for learning. And so, like many things in life, I think it's a balance. I think we need to ask ourselves, how much do we have to do this? What is it that I have to teach that they can't get in any other way? And when I'm finished with that, and in small spurts, hopefully, what am I going to have them do that gives them real insight and experience with what we're talking about? So I think direct instruction is probably never going to go away, but we don't have very much compelling evidence that it is the best thing to do most of the time.
Absolutely. And to kind of piggyback off that, with differentiated instruction, would you say that the use of technology for differentiated instruction is good, bad, or are you kind of indifferent in a sense of a little bit goes a long way?
Yeah. You know, I think one of the things that I have come to understand over the years is we're always looking for the thing that's going to save us. We have a bad habit in education of looking for the next new thing, and this is it. If we do this, life will be fine. And I don't think there is any next new thing that's going to save us. What's going to save us is doing really high quality teaching and learning. And we know what that looks like. We just don't all elect to do it because it's pretty complex. But technology is just a tool. And so if you have a screw in a house that needs to be undone, and you've got a wrench, you're in pretty good condition. If you've got a screw that needs to be loosened and all you've got is a hammer, that's another problem. And I think in too many places we use technology not as a tool, but as a substitute teacher. Go plug the kid into this math program or this literacy thing, as opposed to saying, let's work with the kids to create some questions that need to be answered or some things that need to be expressed. And then let's let them find some tools that can be helpful with that, and make them tools, not solutions to things. So I do think there are things out there in terms of technology that really enhance or have the potential to enhance teaching and learning. And I think there's some others which in their own way are probably okay, but when we start plugging kids into them in some way that causes us as teachers to lose track of those kids, where they are, what their heads are, where their heads are, and to realize whatever it is that's going on in their heads when they're on that machine is not something we can see. And that's okay for a while, but we need to get into those brains again pretty soon after that, and have conversations and dialogue, and not sort of give up our responsibility and opportunity to those tools.
That's wonderful. Do you mind if we just go with a couple more questions, then we'll let you go?
Good.
Okay, so one of the kids in France, they wanted to know, what advice would you have for me who wants to become an educator in America? Is there a certain college that you recommend more than another?
No, this is a great big country, which I'm sure you know, and there are many excellent universities in lots of places. And I think a really important thing too, when you're at that age in your life, is to find a school that's going to be good for you. The district that I mentioned to you that I stayed in for 21 years, at the time was small and it wasn't on the map very much. And I still didn't know who I was, and certainly I wasn't on the map. And it was just an incubator for my ability. They wanted people who would try new things. They were excited about teams of us that got together to work. And if I had had a teaching license that was complete, which I didn't, I had a start of one, but because of my work in the place that the guy got fired, I might have gone to some districts in Northern Virginia around the Washington area, which is where I was living. But as it was, I commuted an hour each way or more every day. So 2.5, 3 hours on the road every day. But it was worth everything because it was the place I needed to be. And I think what I would advise you to do is to look for several kinds of places in the state where I am. And actually, I'm in North Carolina now, but Virginia is where I taught most of my life, all my life, except that first year. There are lots of big schools. The University of Virginia, where I worked, is an amazing school, has a terrific ed school, highly competitive, large, very different feel than right over the mountain from where I am, James Madison University, which is a smallish school, not really small school, but a smaller one. And its main focus in most things is undergraduates. And I think there are people who need to go there compared to the University of Virginia, just because that's where they are in life. They don't need to they need to be nurtured, not necessarily just thrown into the ocean and invited to swim. That's not really what happens at UVA either. But my point is, look at the schools, and it's hard if you're in France or Japan or someplace else to tour those places. But more and more, they have tours online and ways that students who are there can mentor you. And I would look for the place that's best for you. Your first step will not be your last step. So I try to make the first step really, really good. On the whole, what you want with an ed school is a place where it's really valued. So it's a big deal in that university. And I'd want to go to a place where a lot of the people who were teaching in that school had been teachers for a long time, rather than most of them being researchers, because I would want folks who really knew the world that I was going into from experience as well as from theory and research. But many of you who decide that you want, if any of you decide that you want to teach in the US, would find yourself going back later to get a master's degree. And some of you beyond that. And so that's another good step you can take once you understand kind of who you are and where you want to go. But I would go to a place that has a good reputation. There are lots of those, where the ed school is a really big deal to them, and where their affiliation with the schools that you would have opportunities to teach in is really strong and varied.
One of our, thank you for that detailed answer. One of our educators wanted to know, out of 50 years in education and teaching so many different subjects and topics, what is one that stands out in your career, a grade level that stands out in your career, Dr. Carol Ann Tomlinson?
My great love has been 7th grade. And I didn't tell you this at the beginning, but during the years that I was telling people that what I was not going to be when I grew up was a teacher, I had a postscript to that, which I piped in with occasionally. And that was, if I ever do teach, which I will not, I will most certainly not teach 7th grade or adolescents, young adolescents, middle school, junior high. And the reason for that, again, was personal, which many of our decisions are. I was a totally nondescript adolescent. My 6th grade year was just the prelude to a 7th and 8th grade, which were even weirder. And that time period was really a struggle for me in my life. So I had the sense that I really did not want to spend the rest of my life with people who were having that same misery. And so the idea of signing up to teach in middle school or junior high or young adolescents just seemed like the pits to me. But as it turned out, those kids are, I think, just the most fascinating to teach because they are in a sense of flux. And part of them still lives in childhood with such great joy and weird little senses of humor, emotions that flip-flop back and forth really quickly, but they believe they can change the world, and they're not afraid to be honest or to care or to show caring. And the ride with them was just the best. One of the very cool things that most of you can't appreciate now, because many of you have had this your whole life, but for those of us who are antiques, it's such a kick on Facebook or other social media platforms to be connected to a whole lot of those kids that I taught when they were 12 and 13 and 14. And of course, now they have children and in some cases grandchildren. But to be able to look back and remember the things that we did and then see where they have gone and how they're dealing with life. And to hear that some of the things we did, they did then on purpose with their own children because they thought they were cool, is just the best thing. So again, if you get into a school to teach where you're not comfortable, don't feel like you have to stay there. If you're working with a grade level that doesn't seem like a match for you, give yourself enough time to figure out whether it really is. But if it's not, find another place, because there's another place, another age group, if you really want to teach, that will be a good match for you. And honestly, I don't know a profession in the world that has the opportunity to make an impact on people that teaching does if you get it right.
Amen. That's an awesome quote right there. Last question, this will be from me. For all of our students out there, as someone as accomplished as yourself and done so much in your field, what kind of advice would you have for this next generation, whether they want to go into teaching or they want to do something completely different? What is some advice that you can impart on them?
You know, I'm a little bit hesitant to give a blanket piece of advice because the world and the opportunities in it are so varied. But I think what I would say is be a place where you feel like you can make a difference, not just take home a check, a place where you really feel like you can make a difference. You can do that in virtually any field on the planet, if that's the way that you go at it. And also one that causes you to grow. My brief experience, which felt very long when I was advertising manager of the university press, was not feeding me. I was bored out of my socks, and nearly every day we had a big drafting board, you know, that we did cover layouts and stuff on. I was so exhausted just from the boredom that I'd end up falling forward and going to sleep on that drafting board. And even at my age then, I realized you're not going anywhere. This is not exciting to you. You don't get up in the morning jazzed to go to this place. The days are 25 hours long. Do something that makes you better and that allows you to make the world better.